"We're handing all 80 billion to Henry," Dad said, like he was announcing the weather. Then he looked straight at me. "Now leave. You're exiled." My mother smiled. My brother adjusted his cufflinks. I could hear the air vent humming above us as I asked the one question nobody expected. "So you sold the company without my patents?" Mom gave a little laugh. "We sold our business." Across the table, the buyer stopped writing. He slowly closed the folder in front of him, and looked at my father. Actually, that was the moment I realized they hadn't just betrayed me. They had miscalculated everything. Before I dive into the story, hit like and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Let me know if you've ever watched your own family count you out before they understood what you were really holding, because that was exactly the mistake mine was about to make. 8 years earlier, none of this looked dangerous. Back then, our family business still felt small enough to be personal. The office in Austin smelled like burnt coffee printer paper, and the lemon cleaner our night crew used on the conference tables. Dad Michael wore the same navy tie to every investor meeting. Mom Susan kept framed family photos behind her desk. And Henry, my older brother, could walk into a room full of strangers and make them feel like they had known him for years. I was different. I was 35 by the time everything fell apart, but even in my late 20s, I was the one who preferred a quiet lab to a spotlight. I wore simple blazers, tied my brown hair back when I worked, and kept an old blue notebook beside my keyboard. That notebook held the first sketches, calculations, and ugly little diagrams for the automation system that would eventually make our company worth more money than I could comprehend. I still remember the first prototype. I was 27, exhausted and running on vending machine coffee when it finally worked. The machine adjusted to an unexpected obstacle without freezing. I laughed so hard I almost cried. Henry took it to an industry event the next week. He was brilliant on stage. I will give him that. I knew when to pause, when to smile, when to turn a complicated idea into one sentence investors could repeat over dinner. When someone asked how he had come up with the system, Henry glanced toward the back of the room where I was standing. For 1 second, I thought he would point at me. I didn't. Afterward, Mom squeezed my arm and said, "Henry needs the spotlight, honey. You know you hate that stuff." I told myself she was right. That became a pattern. I built. Henry presented. Dad negotiated. Mom polished the story. And every time the company grew, my name somehow got smaller. There was one thing my family never paid much attention to, though. Before the company ever sold a product using my technology, I had created the original core system on my own time with my own equipment and savings. A licensing specialist told me not to give away ownership just because I trusted my family, so I didn't. The company received broad rights to use the technology. I kept the core patents, and the right to approve any transfer of control of the business changed. At the time, it felt like boring paperwork. Years later, when Henry suddenly started appearing in closed-door meetings about a massive acquisition, and my calendar invitations quietly disappeared, I pulled that old blue notebook from my desk drawer. For the first time, I wondered if my family had forgotten what I owned, or if they were counting on me to forget it too. The first time I heard the number, I thought I had misunderstood it. $80 billion. Dad mentioned it casually during dinner, cutting into his steak like he was discussing quarterly revenue, instead of the largest deal our family had ever seen. Henry sat across from me, smiling into his wine glass. "The buyer sees long-term value," he said. I noticed the way he said buyer, not partner, not investor, buyer. Over the next 2 weeks, closed-door meetings multiplied. Henry was suddenly copied on everything. I was copied on almost nothing. Then a document landed in my inbox. Dad called it routine paperwork. I opened it at my kitchen counter with cold coffee beside me, and my old blue notebook within reach. The language was dense, but one sentence stopped me. They needed my written consent to transfer the technology license after the sale. I read it twice, then a third time. The next morning, Dad leaned against my office door and smiled. "Just sign it, Hope. Legal needs to clean up loose ends." Why am I a loose end? His smile disappeared. "Don't make this complicated." Mom tried a softer approach that night. She called while I was folding laundry and told me Henry was under enormous pressure. "This is his moment," she said. "Please don't turn it into some ownership argument." Ownership argument. As if the patents were a family disagreement instead of legal property. I called Daniel. For years, he had been the person I trusted. When my family made me question my own judgment, "Don't sign anything yet," he told me. "Get independent counsel." For the first time in days, I could breathe. Then 3 days later, I walked into a restaurant near downtown Austin and saw Daniel sitting with Henry. They were laughing. A contract folder sat between them. Daniel followed me outside. He didn't even bother lying. Henry had offered him a senior financial role if the acquisition closed. A huge salary, a bonus, a seat near the top. You knew what they were doing to me, I said. Daniel looked away. I know where this deal is going. That hurt more than I expected. So I found Claire Morgan. She read the license agreement in silence, then turned it toward me and tapped one paragraph. Your family can sell their shares, she said. They can sell the building's contracts equipment brand, but they cannot transfer your core patents without your consent. I stared at her. What happens if I don't sign? Claire leaned back. Then they have a very different company to sell. That was the moment something shifted inside me. I still didn't know how far my family was willing to go, so I decided not to warn them. I wanted to see what they would do when they thought I was still too obedient to fight back. Once I stopped pretending everything was normal, the pattern became impossible to miss. My calendar changed first. Meetings I had attended for years disappeared without explanation. My access to certain internal reports was reduced. Henry started walking through the engineering floor with people I had never met, introducing them as if he had built the place himself. Then Dad called me into his office. A single envelope sat on his desk. $50,000, he said. Clean exit, no drama. Inside was a severance agreement. I would resign, quietly sign the transfer consent, waive future claims, and agree not to discuss the circumstances of my departure. I looked up at him. You want my patents for $50,000? Dad's jaw tightened. I want you to stop acting like this company revolves around you. That sentence followed me all the way home. Claire told me not to respond emotionally, so I didn't. I declined through counsel. That was when Mom's whisper campaign started. At first it was subtle. Hope is overwhelmed. Hope is taking things personally. Hope has always struggled with pressure. People who had spent years asking me to fix impossible technical problems suddenly spoke to me with careful little smiles, like I might break if they used the wrong tone. Then came the gala. It was supposed to celebrate the coming acquisition. The family estate glowed under warm lights. Glasses clinked. A jazz trio played near the terrace. Investors stood beneath framed photographs of our smiling family, while servers carried trays of champagne through rooms I had grown up in. Henry was everywhere, shaking hands, laughing, accepting congratulations. Mom introduced him to one group as the driving force behind our technology. I heard every word. I said nothing. Then I saw Megan carrying presentation folders near the dining room. Henry stopped her. You missed a formatting issue in one of these, he said loudly. Megan flushed. I used the version I was given. Henry laughed. Maybe engineering needs people who can follow basic instructions. I stepped between them. That presentation came from my team. If there's an issue, talk to me. His smile vanished. You really can't stand one night not being the center of attention, can you? I almost laughed at the absurdity. Then he lifted his wine glass. The movement looked accidental. It wasn't. Red wine poured across the front of my cream blouse and dark jacket. The room went quiet. I could feel it soaking through the fabric, cold against my skin. Henry widened his eyes. Hope, come on. It slipped. I looked at Dad. He stared into his drink. I looked at Mom. She leaned closer and whispered, please don't make a scene. Something inside me finally went still. I walked to the restroom and stared at myself under the harsh white lights. Red wine, tired eyes, 8 years of excuses. I opened my bag. My old blue notebook was inside. I ran my thumb across the worn cover and called Claire. I'm done protecting them. The next morning, every communication went through her. We preserved emails, payments, meeting records, access logs, and security footage. Claire formally notified the buyer that I had not consented to any transfer of my patents. Dad still pushed toward closing. I thought $80 billion made him untouchable. Then the final meeting invitation appeared on my screen. I closed my laptop, slipped the blue notebook into my bag, and headed for the boardroom. This time they had no idea I was bringing the one thing they could not buy. Dad was already standing when I entered the boardroom. Henry sat beside him in a charcoal suit, one ankle resting casually over his knee. Mom had a porcelain cup in front of her, untouched. David Walker and 3 members of the buyer's legal team occupied the other side of the table. Claire took the seat beside me. Dad didn't ask us to sit. We're handing all $80 billion to Henry, he declared. Then he looked straight at me. Now leave, you're exiled. For a second nobody moved. I looked at Henry. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at Mom. She almost seemed relieved. So you sold the company without my patents? Mom chuckled. We sold our business. Across the table, David stopped writing. He stood. Actually, Dad's expression changed. David closed the folder in front of him. This transaction has not closed. The room went silent. The funds have not been released, he continued. And as of this morning, we have a serious ownership problem. Dad turned toward me. What did you do? Claire answered before I could. Hope did nothing except decline to transfer property she owns. She placed the licensing agreement on the table. David's attorney opened it to the marked section. The company had broad rights to use my technology, but it did not own the core patents. And if control of this company changed those rights, could not move to a new owner without my written consent. David looked directly at me. Did you sign that consent? No. Henry shot out of his chair. This is ridiculous. She works for us. She built it here, not the original system, Claire said. She placed the ownership records beside the agreement. Dates, patent filings, development records. My blue notebook sat quietly in front of me, its corners worn soft from years of use. Dad stared at the papers. Then he tried a different angle. This is a family dispute. Hope is angry because Henry is taking over. Claire slid another document across the table. The severance offer. $50,000 in exchange for my consent, my silence, and my release of future claims. David read it once. Then again, his face hardened. You attempted to terminate the patent owner before closing, and condition her severance on transferring the asset. Dad's voice rose. That is not what happened. It's exactly what happened, I said. Henry slammed his palm against the table. You're holding $80 billion hostage because you're jealous. I finally looked at him. I'm not holding anything of yours, Henry. His face went red. This belongs to the family. No, I said. That's what you kept telling yourselves. Claire opened one final folder. After I refused to sign, Henry had hired an outside contractor to find another way into systems containing technology he did not control. There was no dramatic secret recording. There didn't need to be. There were payments, messages, invoices, access logs, and a contractor who stopped the work, hired counsel, and agreed to cooperate after realizing there was a legitimate ownership dispute. Henry went pale. Dad turned toward him. What did you do? I was protecting the deal. David's chair scraped against the floor as he stood again. No. You were creating additional liability inside an $80 billion acquisition. Mom finally put down her cup. Her hand was shaking. David looked toward his attorneys. We're done. Dad blinked. What does that mean? It means the closing conditions have not been satisfied. The acquisition is terminated. No funds will be released. Henry sank slowly back into his chair. $80 billion. Gone before it had ever truly been theirs. Dad stared at me as if I had destroyed him, but I hadn't. I had not taken his company. I had not touched his money. I had not sabotaged a single system. I had simply stopped giving my family permission to sell me along with everything else. I picked up my blue notebook. Months earlier, Dad had planned to have security escort me through that same door. This time I walked through it on my own. And behind me, for the first time in 8 years, Henry was the one left sitting in the room without an answer. The fallout did not happen overnight. That mattered to me. For years my family had treated consequences like something that happened to other people. But this time there was no dramatic explosion. No single moment where everything vanished. It came apart piece by piece. First the buyer formally walked away. Then the company had to disclose that the technology at the center of its valuation could not be transferred under the terms they had promised. Investors pulled back. Lenders started asking harder questions. Contracts that once looked secure suddenly had to be reviewed. The company was still worth something. Just nowhere near what Dad had convinced himself it was worth. Within months, Michael Bennett was no longer running it. He resigned after a series of legal disputes, mounting debts and pressure from people who had once treated him like the smartest man in every room. Mom took it worse than he did. Susan had always controlled the story. She knew who to call, what to say, which version of an event made our family look polished and united. But legal records are stubborn things. So were emails. So were meeting notes. Once enough facts became public, people stopped repeating her version of me. Hope was emotional became Hope had refused to sign away her patents. Hope was difficult became Hope had asked for independent legal advice. Hope was trying to destroy the family became Hope had protected properties she legally owned. For the first time, Mom could not edit the narrative. Henry lost his position not long after. The outside access issue became part of a formal investigation, and the people involved had lawyers of their own. I stayed out of it. Claire handled what needed to be handled. I did not call reporters demanding Henry be ruined. I did not celebrate when companies stopped returning his calls. The truth was enough. Daniel reached out 6 months later. We met at a quiet coffee shop where we used to study together years ago. He looked older, not dramatically, just tired around the eyes. I made the wrong choice, he said. I stirred my coffee. Yes, he swallowed. I thought the deal was certain. I know. I was scared of being left behind. That almost made me smile, so was I. He looked at me then, maybe realizing how ugly that excuse sounded when placed beside what he had done. I want to fix this. I shook my head. I don't hate you, Daniel. His shoulders loosened. But I don't trust you either. They tightened again. I left before he could turn an apology into another negotiation. By then, Megan and I were building something new. Smaller at first, cleaner. Every engineer's name stayed attached to their work. Every inventor knew what they owned. Every agreement was explained before anyone signed it. When I gave our first major presentation, I carried my old blue notebook onto the stage. I did not need it anymore. I wanted it there. A reminder of the woman who once stood at the back of a room while somebody else accepted applause for her work. Almost a year after the boardroom, Mom contacted me. Dad's health had declined. There were medications, medical bills, appointments they were struggling to cover. She asked for money. I sat with the message for a long time. Then I called Claire. Verify the bills, I said. Pay the essential medical expenses directly. Claire paused. And your parents, they don't get access to me. I did not send cash. I did not demand an apology. I did not reopen the door. That evening I stood by the windows of my new office looking over Austin when Megan called from the conference room. They're ready for you, Hope. I picked up the blue notebook. This time when I walked into the room, nobody was waiting for Henry. They were waiting for me. I used to think family loyalty meant staying quiet, giving more, and forgiving faster. I was wrong. Love does not give anyone ownership over your work, your future, or your peace. Henry lost an $80 billion deal, but that was never my real victory. My victory was walking away without needing my family to admit what they had done. Sometimes the strongest boundary is simply refusing to return to the place that broke you. If this story hit home, tell me in the comments. Share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories about taking your power back.